Welcome to the 2D Crime Files channel, where we can both shiver at the sight of crime and laugh out loud at the right moments of teasing. Today, I invite you to sit down, pour yourself a cup of hot coffee, or, if you prefer, a glass of iced tea, because the story we are about to embark on will be long and full of twists and turns. Trust me, you won't want to leave your chair. Now imagine a morning in late December, just a few hours away from Christmas. The entire city of Modesto, California, is filled with a festive atmosphere. Every house is bustling with lights, wrapping presents, and preparing turkeys. But right at that moment, an urgent phone call comes in from the police station. My wife is missing. Laci has been missing since this morning. The man on the other end of the line sounds shaky and urgent. That is Scott Peterson, the exemplary husband in the eyes of many people. But just a few days later, he himself became the prime suspect in a case that shocked America. And here is the climax, ladies and gentlemen. 4 months later, in the cold, gray waters of San Francisco Bay, the body of a young woman, still pregnant, washed up on shore. It was none other than Laci Peterson, the beautiful wife who had disappeared on Christmas Eve. Just a few hundred meters away, the tiny body of a newborn baby, Laci's unborn son, was also found. The whole of America was shocked. The news headlines on television, the newspapers ran red letters. Christmas horror, pregnant woman disappears, truth reveals in Cold Bay. The question now is, who is the killer? How did a happy family turn into a tragic tragedy? And more importantly, what evidence led the police from the missing person call to the shocking moment on the bay shore? We will follow every clue, every testimony, every seemingly small detail, like a cup of coffee spilled on the table. But in true crime, no detail is innocent. So, buckle up, prepare yourself. Today's story, the Laci Peterson case, Clues by the Bay, will start right here from the climax, the body washed ashore. Then we will rewind, stringing together each piece to find the answer. One winter morning, the California sunshine was not warm enough to dispel the lingering cold of December. The city of Modesto seemed to be immersed in a bustling atmosphere of Christmas preparations. Every house was hanging lights. The streets were selling green pine wreaths. Children were chattering about Santa Claus, and adults were busy buying gifts. In that scene, Laci Peterson's small family was no exception. The 27-year-old woman, with shiny brown hair and a smile as bright as the Christmas lights on the street, is 8 months pregnant and is expected to give birth to her first son in a few weeks. She named the baby Connor, a simple but loving name. To Laci, Connor is the whole world, the promise of a complete family with her husband Scott Peterson. Scott, a tall, handsome man, once the dream of many girls in college, is now a future young father. They live in a spacious house in a peaceful residential area, where neighbors know Laci as a gentle wife who often bakes cakes for neighbors and is the type of woman people call the perfect housewife. Scott, in the eyes of his friends, is a lovable guy who knows how to smile, knows how to talk, and seems to have it all. A beautiful wife, a baby on the way, a stable job. But, as they say, sometimes a perfect life is like a soap bubble, glittering in the light, waiting to burst with a single blow. On Christmas Eve 2002, as everyone was preparing to gather around the turkey dinner, that bubble of happiness burst. On December 24th, Scott said he left home early in the morning to go fishing in San Francisco Bay. Meanwhile, Laci, 8 months pregnant, was said to have stayed home, walking her golden retriever around the neighborhood. It sounded normal, too normal. A husband went fishing. A pregnant wife went out with her dog. But here's the thing. Laci Peterson was never seen again after that morning. That fateful moment began when neighbors discovered Laci's dog wandering the streets, its leash still around its neck, but its owner absent. At first, everyone thought Laci had let the dog run around, but their instincts told them something was wrong. Could an 8-month pregnant woman leave her dog wandering around the streets and disappear? In the afternoon, Scott returned home. He said he had been fishing all day, but what made the police and the public later shudder was Scott's strange calm demeanor. Instead of frantically calling 911 right away, he called his mother-in-law and asked if Laci had stopped by. When no one saw Laci, and that's when the investigation began. The police receive a call late in the afternoon about a pregnant woman missing. At first glance, they might have thought it was a case of tired wife missing for a few hours. But when they learned that Laci was 8 months pregnant and had disappeared on Christmas Eve, their professional instincts made them take it seriously. The neighborhood was suddenly in an uproar. Neighbors gathered to gossip. Police lights flashed in the winter night, and the usually peaceful Modesto became the center of whispers. Where is that woman? Could she have been kidnapped? Or the question that no one was afraid to say out loud. Or was it her husband? And that was the starting point for a case that would shock the entire country for months to come. Before we get into the details, let's pause for a moment to look back at the lives of Laci and Scott, because in any case, it's always important to understand the main character. Laci Denise Rocha was born in 1975 and grew up in a middle-class family in California. She was raised in love, stood out for her cheerful personality, loved taking care of others, and was especially talented at beautifying the house. If Instagram existed at that time, Laci would have been a real hot mom blogger, posting a series of sparkling kitchen photos, skillfully arranged flower vases, and photos of her pet dog lying neatly on the sofa. In short, Laci was the model of the perfect American housewife. Scott Peterson, born in 1972, is 3 years older than Laci and attended California State University, where he met Laci. Initially, Scott left an impression with his handsome appearance like an American baseball prince. He loved sports, liked to talk humorously, and seemed to have a natural charm. When Laci met Scott, she told her friends that this was the man of her dreams. The two quickly dated, then got married and built a family. On the outside, it was an enviable sight. A young, beautiful couple with stable jobs, now expecting their first child. But as we shall see, that picture of happiness was gradually torn apart by hidden cracks. On the evening of December 23rd, the day before Christmas, Laci called her mother, happily telling her that she would be preparing a Christmas party the next day, and that she planned to cook the family's favorite dish, lasagna. Her voice was cheerful, with no hint of sadness. One could not imagine that just a few hours later, she would disappear without a trace. On December 24th, around 10 a.m., a neighbor saw Laci walking her dog near the house. This was the last time anyone confirmed seeing her. Around noon, the dog was spotted running around the street, and Laci was nowhere to be seen. When the police arrived, Scott told them that he had left early to go fishing at the Berkeley Marina. On the surface, it didn't sound unusual, but the police were puzzled. Who would go fishing on Christmas morning, when his wife was 8 months pregnant, preparing for a family party? What was particularly puzzling was that Scott remembered exactly what kind of fish he caught, what gear he brought, but had no evidence other than the boat receipt. That discrepancy caught the attention of detectives. That night, the news of the missing pregnant woman immediately covered local television. Laci's image, bright smile, soft brown hair, appeared on the screen, along with the information, 27 years old, 160 centimeters tall, about 60 kilograms, 8 months pregnant, missing while walking her dog. The Modesto community immediately joined forces to search. Hundreds of volunteers poured in, posting posters everywhere, searching every corner of the park, every lawn. People brought flashlights, sniffer dogs, and canoes to search around nearby lakes and rivers. The atmosphere was like a military campaign, except that the missing person was a gentle, pregnant woman about to become a mother. The police were now organizing a search, and were also keeping an eye on Scott. They were keen to notice that his attitude was not like that of a husband who had lost his wife. He did not cry or panic, and even appeared quite calm when answering the press. Some reporters described Scott as more sober than the police. And here we, the people recounting the case, can insert a faux comment. Hey, if my wife had disappeared on Christmas Eve, I would have run around the streets screaming, not sitting there calmly holding a microphone to answer questions. It was this unusualness that sowed the seeds of doubt in the public's mind. But let's be fair. At that time, there was no clear evidence to convict Scott. People only saw a series of small but difficult to explain details. For example, why did Scott go fishing on Christmas Day? Why didn't he call the police immediately when he noticed his wife missing, instead of calling his relatives first? And why was his attitude so calm? All of this made the police remember and put Scott under the surveillance microscope. In the following days, the search for Laci became a hot topic across the country. The media reported it hourly, and people everywhere watched as if it were a live detective movie. But the heartbreaking thing was, the more people searched, the more they found no trace. Laci Peterson's case leaves many questions hanging. Where did Laci Peterson go? Was she kidnapped, or was she the victim of a family conspiracy? And her husband, Scott, was he just an unlucky man? In the first days after Laci Peterson disappeared, the entire city of Modesto turned into a search zone. From parks, riverbanks, suburban streets, to vacant lots, everywhere there were footprints of police, dogs, and volunteers. Locals, accustomed to the warm scene of Christmas, now witnessed groups of people in thick coats, holding flashlights to shine on every tree, every culvert, calling Laci's name in the cold wind. Posters of her, a young pregnant woman with a gentle smile, were plastered on utility poles, supermarkets, gas stations, to the point that just stepping outside, anyone could see Laci's face as a haunting reminder. An 8-month pregnant woman had disappeared right in this community. But what gradually puzzled the entire community was Scott's attitude. While hundreds of people volunteered to quit their jobs and search day and night, the husband, who should have been the most miserable, appeared with a calm face, sometimes even smiling awkwardly in front of the reporters' cameras. The press began to ask questions. Why didn't Scott shed tears? Why wasn't he exhausted from anxiety? Some journalists described Scott as looking more like a charity bazaar attendee than a man looking for his missing wife. And this is when public opinion began to shift from sympathy to skepticism. The American media, which is famous for digging into and exaggerating, immediately turned the disappearance into a news storm. TV channels broadcast continuously, talk shows discussed, psychologists analyzed. All camera lights were focused on the Peterson house. Every time Scott stepped outside, dozens of reporters pointed microphones. Neighbors gathered to watch. However, instead of taking the opportunity to call for help in finding his wife, Scott often avoided or gave bland answers. People gradually got the feeling that he was playing a bad role. The peak of suspicion came when the police discovered that Scott had a shocking secret. He was having an affair. And not just a fling, but a long-term relationship with a woman named Amber Fry. Amber was a single mother, blonde, working as a massage therapist in Fresno, not far from Modesto. She met Scott through friends, and from the beginning Scott introduced himself as single. Yes, exactly, a man who was about to be a father with an 8-month pregnant wife at home was telling his lover that he was single. Hearing this, you must have wanted to exclaim, "Where is my 8-month pregnant wife?" When this news was revealed, public opinion across America exploded. If before Scott was just a slightly strange husband, now he had turned into a cheating husband. People began to see Scott's every action through the lens of guilt. Going fishing on Christmas Day, probably an excuse, not crying to find his wife, because he had prepared a script. And in the eyes of many, there was only one explanation. Scott wanted to escape his marriage to be with his new lover, so he attacked his wife. But then again, at that time, the police still had no concrete physical evidence. All was suspicion, testimony, and contradiction. They found no traces of blood in the house, no witnesses to Scott harming his wife. Even the time of Laci's disappearance was unclear, and Scott going fishing, in theory, did not prove that he had committed the crime. So the case became a giant TV show where the public, the media, and the police together put together the pieces to paint a picture of the crime. Throughout January 2003, the search continued. Volunteer groups sailed around San Francisco Bay, where Scott said he had gone fishing. Police used sonar, divers, and even planes to scan the area. But the vast ocean, the murky water, and there was no trace of Laci. And the more there was nothing, the more public attention focused on Scott. They analyzed the way he stood, his eyes, even his smile. Everyone could see that something was wrong. One of the details that caused a stir at the time was a recording of a phone call between Scott and Amber. While the disappearance was being broadcast on television, Scott was still calmly calling his mistress, saying he was in Paris watching the New Year's Eve fireworks, when in fact he was attending a prayer service for his wife at a local church. Imagine, on one side, his wife's family was crying and praying, while the husband whispered affectionately on the phone, "I'm in France. I miss you so much." It was infuriating. Thanks to Amber, the police had more leverage. When she realized she had been deceived, Amber decided to cooperate with the police, providing the entire recording of her calls with Scott. And this evidence later became a blockbuster that helped convict him. It must be said that at that time, Amber was like an unwilling but extremely important witness. She appeared before the press, publicly declaring that she had been deceived by Scott and now wanted to help find the truth for Laci. The whole of America watched, half sympathetic to Amber, half angry with Scott. In the press, Scott was labeled the guy, so America's number one. But the question remained, did he really kill his wife in addition to having an affair? In the following weeks, the police continued to question Scott. They found more and more holes in his story. He started off saying he was going fishing, then changed the details about the time, where he parked, and even fumbled when describing the fish he was going to catch. The police patiently asked questions, and Scott kept beating around the bush, as if he was trying to remember a script but had forgotten a few pages. The press called it the lie trap. Once you lie once, you have to think of 10 more to cover it up, and then it will eventually leak out. Meanwhile, Laci's family, especially her mother, Sharon Rocha, grew increasingly painful and stressed. She had to deal with the loss of her son and watch her son-in-law act like a cold outsider. Sharon broke down in tears on camera several times, begging anyone with information to come forward. Image of a person, the grieving mother touched the hearts of millions of Americans, turning the case from a local event into a national tragedy. The search continued, but to no avail. As the days passed, the hope of finding Laci alive grew slimmer. By this time, many people were convinced that she was dead, waiting to find her body. And this put pressure on Scott. If his wife was missing without a trace, the husband would be the first suspect. It was like playing the game Among Us, where the light flashed and whoever was closest to the victim would be voted off immediately. The only difference was that this was not a game, but a human life. Thus, the second chapter of the story ended in a tense atmosphere. The entire community was exhausted from the hopeless search. The media was furious. His mistress Amber exposed the truth of her affair, and Scott Peterson, from a model husband, had become the #1 suspect in the eyes of the entire United States. In April 2003, after nearly 4 months of hopeless searching, the San Francisco Sea finally revealed the cruel truth. One misty morning, as the waves lapped gently on the bay, a walker spotted a small figure drifting ashore. At first, no one believed it, but as they got closer, their limbs gave way. It was the body of a newborn baby, still unborn, with the umbilical cord still attached. Not far away, the waves brought another body ashore. A young woman, 8 months pregnant, her body already decomposed, but her stomach still there, showing that the baby had been inside. The entire United States was shocked. Special news on CNN, Fox News, and ABC all interrupted their programs to broadcast live. The name Laci Peterson was no longer just the missing wife of Modesto, but the victim of a brutal crime. She was turned into a lifeless body, and her child, who had not yet had a chance to cry out at birth, also died with her. People were shocked, neighbors cried, and millions of viewers in front of their TV screens exclaimed, "Oh my God, how cruel!" In that mournful atmosphere, all eyes immediately turned to Scott. Because if before, people were still hesitant, no body yet, not sure, now the body was present, and Scott's statement, "went fishing in San Francisco Bay," suddenly turned into the most dangerous evidence against him. Exactly. The place Scott said he went fishing was the area where the bodies of Laci and Connor were found. Hearing this, everyone shuddered. Was it a coincidence? Or was it an obvious truth? The police immediately cordoned off the area. They held a press conference to announce. The bodies found were those of Laci Peterson and the fetus Connor. The whole of America exploded with indignation. Mothers burst into tears. Groups of women took to the streets holding banners demanding justice for Laci, and the press ran a bright red headline: "End of tragedy. Opening of the trial of the century." Scott now became the focus of hatred. Every detail of his unusual life was recalled, from his Christmas fishing trip to his insincere tone when he called Amber to his forced smiles for the cameras. It all came together like a picture: a cold-blooded husband who murdered his wife to pursue a new lover. But the police knew that to convict in court, they needed more than public outrage. They needed evidence. And so, the forensics department stepped in. The autopsy revealed that Laci's body had been decomposing in the water for months. The body was not intact, making it difficult to determine the cause of death. But the key point was that Connor's fetus appeared to have been expelled during the decomposition process, rather than removed by surgery. This further proved that Laci had been murdered and dumped into the bay while still pregnant. Forensic experts, though unable to provide a clear cause of death, confirmed that the body fit the time of Laci's disappearance, Christmas 2002. The location where she was found matched where Scott said he had gone fishing. Putting the two together, the picture became clearer. While the forensics were coming to a conclusion, the police were secretly monitoring Scott, and they noticed very suspicious behavior. Instead of staying home to grieve, Scott began to move around a lot, changing his phone, buying a series of strange items: guns, knives, even dyeing his hair and renting a new car. At its peak, when the police caught him near the Mexican border, Scott was carrying a suitcase of cash, a new cell phone, a clean shave, lighter hair dye, and a bunch of fake IDs. Sorry, if he was just an innocent husband, why act like a Hollywood fugitive? The media, of course, did not ignore this detail. The press ran with headlines: "Scott plans to flee to Mexico, cold-blooded husband about to be arrested." People were both angry and gloating. Finally, the time had come for this man to pay the price. On April 18, 2003, Scott Peterson was officially arrested and charged with the murder of his wife and unborn son. The image of him in prison clothes, his eyes lost in thought, broadcast on TV, made many people feel satisfied. Justice had begun. But there was also a small group asking, where is the evidence? Did anyone see Scott kill his wife with their own eyes? Was there blood, a murder weapon, any physical traces? Or was it all based on coincidence and adultery? It is true that at this stage, the Scott Peterson case became a battlefield for lawyers, the press, and the public. Supporters asserted that he was clearly guilty, no one other than her husband. Opponents said, America is a country that respects the rule of law and cannot be convicted based on hatred alone. This is why the case later became one of the most famous trials in America, where the public and the law faced each other. During his time in prison awaiting trial, Scott continued to be the subject of entertainment news. His every move, from what he ate in prison to who he wrote letters to, was scrutinized by the press. Talk shows mocked him. Even comedy shows made fun of him. He was compared to O.J. Simpson, a murder case that the public watched like a soap opera. At this point, let me insert a humorous comment. Apple, if Netflix had been born a few years earlier, the Scott Peterson case would have been a 10-episode series, released during the Christmas season, guaranteed to have sky-high ratings. But back to reality. The pain of Laci's family is real. Her mother, Sharon, cried every day. They held a funeral for both mother and daughter, with thousands of people coming to see them off in tears. The photo of Laci smiling gently, her pregnant belly full, placed next to an empty crib, a symbol of grief that moved the whole world. That scene became a symbol of loss and also the strongest call for justice. Bring the killer to light. So, Chapter 3 ended in a climax of tragedy. The body was found, the pain was real, Scott was arrested for his suspicious escape, and the whole of America focused its anger on the upcoming trial. But like every big case, the story does not end here. Because in court, everything will be different. Lawyers, prosecutors, evidence, witnesses, and unexpected twists. Will justice prevail, or will Scott bend the law? The next chapter will take us into the court show, where truth and lies fight each other more intensely. On June 1st, 2004, more than a year after Scott Peterson was arrested, the trial for the murder of his wife and unborn son officially began in Redwood City, California. The whole country was glued to the case, no different from waiting for a new episode of a famous TV series. The press jostled for seats from 5 a.m. Hundreds of people stood outside the courthouse, some carrying banners reading "Justice for Laci," others just to witness the real-life villain with their own eyes. From the beginning, the atmosphere was more like a show than a trial. Prosecutor Mark Garagos opened with strong accusations. Scott Peterson is not a loving husband. He is a traitor, a man who calculated to kill his wife and children to free himself. This statement immediately resounded across the newspapers, making the public nod. That's right, it speaks for the people. The prosecution presented the big picture. Scott had an affair, wanted to be free, planned to kill his wife, and then dump her body in San Francisco Bay. They emphasized the irrefutable coincidence. The place where Scott went fishing was exactly where the body was found. They painted a picture of Scott as cold, unconcerned about his wife's disappearance, and instead continued his romantic conversation with Amber Frey. More importantly, the prosecution called Amber as the main witness. Amber took the stand, her voice trembling but clear. She recounted the details of her relationship with Scott, from the time they met, believing he was single, to learning he was married and that she was pregnant. In particular, she told of the New Year's Eve 2002 phone call when Scott whispered that he was in Paris, when in fact he was in the middle of a vigil for Laci. The courtroom fell silent, then erupted. The recording was played, Scott's voice ringing out, "I miss you, baby." Immediately afterwards, the sound of reporters typing on keyboards rang out, and the next day's headlines read, "Two-faced husband lies to mistress when wife goes missing." Amber's testimony was a steel fist to Scott's image, transforming him from a suspect to a despicable person in the eyes of the public. However, the defense attorneys did not sit still. They countered that adultery did not equal murder. He may have been a bad husband, but that does not mean he was a murderer. The attorneys emphasized that there was no direct physical evidence, no blood, no murder weapon, no traces at the scene. They tried to sow doubt in the minds of the jury. If you are not 100% sure, you cannot sentence a person to death. This is a familiar tactic in big cases, hitting on reasonable doubt. The prosecution countered by stringing together all the details, the lies, the unusual attitude, the preparation for escape, and especially the coincidence of the location. They compared, an innocent person would scream for his wife, not dye his hair, change his phone, carry cash and fake ID, and run to Mexico. That question was like a knife pointed straight at Scott. Meanwhile, the outside media was no different from a circus. Every day, dozens of TV trucks broadcast live. Reporters crowded together. Legal commentators analyzed every look, every gesture in the courtroom. Americans talked about it in coffee shops, on buses, even during lunch breaks at the office. Scott Peterson became a familiar name, no less than a movie star. From this perspective, a common saying could be inserted. People talk about Scott Peterson like a Premier League football table. Every day there are comments, there are statistics. During the trial, a number of other witnesses were also called. Neighbors said they saw Laci walking her dog on the morning of December 24th, but their testimony was mixed, and no one was sure of the exact time. Another witness said he saw a woman who looked like Laci walking afterward, which the defense attorney used to raise suspicions that Laci might have been alive after Scott left the house. However, the prosecutor immediately countered. The vague testimony cannot deny the fact that the body was floating in the bay. Forensics were also brought to court, explaining the condition of the body. Although they could not confirm the cause of death, they confirmed that the time of death was consistent with the day Laci went missing. The jury, hearing day after day, gradually leaned toward a single scenario. Scott was the killer. Meanwhile, Laci's family, especially her mother, appeared in court every day. The image of the elderly mother sitting and crying when hearing the details of her daughter's murder moved many jurors to tears. The power of that emotion sometimes outweighed the evidence. The drama climaxed when the prosecutor played a recording of Scott calling Amber at the exact moment the church held a prayer service for Laci. Hymns were playing in the background, and Scott was whispering to his lover. The whole courtroom exploded, and some people were in tears of anger. The question on everyone's mind was, if you didn't kill your wife, how could you be so cruel? The trial lasted for months, like a popular TV series. Every day was a new episode. This witness, that evidence, arguing back and forth. The defense tried to convince the prosecution that there was no direct evidence, but the prosecutor kept repeating, every little piece of the puzzle makes up the complete picture. And the prosecutor, they were almost certain of Scott's guilt. In November 2004, after 6 months of trial and 7 days of deliberation, the jury returned its verdict. Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder of Laci and second-degree murder of unborn Connor. The courtroom held its breath, then erupted. Laci's family hugged and cried, and the public cheered outside. Scott sat motionless, his face pale, his eyes distant. But that wasn't the end of it. A few weeks later, the sentencing hearing took place. The prosecution asked for the death penalty. The defense attorney begged the jury to spare his life, saying, "We're not 100% sure." But when images of Laci's pregnant belly and unborn Connor were shown on the screen, Sharon Rocha shed tears, and the jury chose the death penalty. Scott Peterson was sentenced to death by lethal injection. The whole country exploded with the news. Justice for Laci, murderer sentenced to death. Many people considered this a victory for justice, a consolation for Laci's family. However, some legal observers were still concerned. There was no physical evidence, only indirect evidence. But regardless of the debate, the verdict was made. Scott was sent to San Quentin prison, awaiting execution. This trial became iconic, featured in books, documentaries, and talk shows. People called it California's trial of the century. And Scott Peterson, from a husband who had everything, now became a death row inmate. But the story is not over, because as we know, in the American legal system, the death penalty often entails a series of appeals and prolonged debates. And Scott, of course, did not miss the opportunity to cling to the last fragile hope. After being sentenced to death in late 2004, Scott Peterson was sent to San Quentin State Prison, one of the most secure prisons in the United States. The image of a man who once had it all, a beautiful wife, a baby on the way, a stable home, now wearing an orange prison jumpsuit and locked in a cramped cell, was a living testament to the saying, heaven is only a step away from hell. But the legal journey was not over. In the United States, capital punishment almost always entails years, even decades of appeals. Scott's lawyers quickly filed a motion, claiming that the trial was flawed in many ways, from jury selection, media bias, to the prosecution's lack of direct evidence. They argue that Scott did not receive a fair trial because the entire country had already viewed him as a criminal before the verdict was handed down. Indeed, looking back, it is undeniable that the media created enormous pressure. The press followed every detail, from the cap Scott wore in prison to the letter he wrote to his mother. 24/7 television, talk shows, and even documentaries portrayed Scott as a cold-blooded monster. In that context, could the jury maintain absolute objectivity? This was the key point for later appeals. In the years that followed, Scott's lawyers filed repeated motions, emphasizing that the jury selection was unfair. Some of the jurors had previously expressed hatred for Scott. They also argued that the prosecution's evidence was circumstantial and not strong enough to warrant a death sentence. However, the initial appeals were all rejected. Scott remained in San Quentin, waiting day by day, but also knowing that time is a companion in the American legal system. The longer the case, the more hope there is. Meanwhile, in society, the Laci Peterson case became a cultural icon. It was featured in books, documentaries, and television shows. Every year at Christmas, the press recalls the story of the pregnant wife missing on holiday. It is like a scar that never heals in the memory of America. Laci's family, especially her mother Sharon Rocha, continues to be the face of the fight for victims' rights. Sharon writes books, gives speeches, and calls for protection for pregnant women. For her, the death sentence cannot bring back her daughter and grandson, but at least it is the consolation that justice has been served. However, in 2020, the unexpected happened. The California Supreme Court overturned Scott Peterson's death sentence on the grounds that the jury was improperly selected, violating fair procedures. However, the murder conviction remained. This created another media earthquake. Scott's supporters shouted, "See, the whole system was wrong from the start." Opponents were indignant. "Don't dream of getting away with it. The killer of his wife and children must pay." The case once again made headlines, and Scott went from being a death row inmate to a life sentence without parole. Scott is still in prison, but the story is not over. Lawyers continue to try to reopen the trial, emphasizing media bias and the ambiguity of the evidence. And in some ways, the American public is still divided. Some believe Scott was a cold-blooded killer. Others believe he was the victim of a media trial. Either way, the Laci Peterson case is remembered as a landmark where love, betrayal, family tragedy, and the power of the media collide. It also raises a big question for the judiciary. Can a trial be fair when the whole world has already judged it? At the end of this story, it is impossible not to mention the key detail that changed the whole case: Scott's affair with Amber Fry. Without Amber, Scott would have been just a suspicious husband, but there was not enough evidence to convict him. It was Amber, with her recorded calls and emotional testimony, who turned the case from a mysterious disappearance into a cruel tragedy of betrayal. And it was that emotional deception that turned public opinion, turning Scott from a pitiful husband into a traitorous villain. Up to this point, the story of the Laci Peterson case has gone through all the stages: love, happiness, disappearance, tragedy, trial, death sentence, and appeal. But like every true crime series, each ending opens a new door. Because behind this whole tragedy, there is another topic that needs to be examined: the secret love affair, the affair that changed everything. That is the trigger, the turning point that turned the whole case around. And if you think you know everything, wait until the truth behind the calls, the sweet words, and the love drama is revealed. Because sometimes, just one secret love affair can change the fate of many people, even an entire country.